G'day Mike, how are you?
I'm well, thanks, and you?
Very well. Will the exclusion of Huawei cost you any extra money? Will it have an impact on your costs?
No, it won't. We have got our contracts for our GPON equipment in place, and they're very competitive.
Will it have any impact on you at all? I mean, can I ask you, do you regret the fact that they're going to be excluded?
It's really not up to me to comment, Alan, on either tender decisions or on security issues.
In that update you provided last week, or I suppose sort of the relaunch, you changed your network deployment definition from homes passed to construction completed or underway. Why is that, and what impact does it have in terms of the numbers of homes passed in that 3-year period?
Well, if I can be very clear about this, we have changed no definitions at all. The homes passed and the homes activated are what we put in our last corporate plan, and we will be putting it in our next corporate plan. What we announced last week was a 3-year rollout to make sure that we can inform the public and inform our potential customers of where we'll be going. As you would know, there's been an enormous amount of interest in this project, and there is it's really hard to describe how much need there is in the community for information about where we'll be going and when we'll be starting. And that's what we were supplying last week. In the corporate plan that we will be providing to the government, by the end of May, we will have the homes passed and the homes activated as we did in the last corporate plan.
If Malcolm, if the coalition wins the election, I'm not asking you to speculate on that, but if they did, how would they change your corporate plan as you study it now?
I can only respond to what I read in the papers, Bob. I have no additional information, and clearly there's been some hints of perhaps a different approach. I think if that was to happen, we would just have to look at what was asked of the company as a government business enterprise and provide the government of the day with a response on how best to execute on that, as we do with the government today. They ask us to do certain things, we give them feedback on the costs and the technical feasibility of that. That would be what we would continue to do.
Would it be true to say that what you're embarking on now is perhaps the lowest yield return expenditure? In other words, all the upfront things, the higher yield tends to be in the later years.
I certainly think it's true to say that there is some infrastructure that you have to put in place before you can start connecting up customers. For example, the transit network that connects what are called the fibre access nodes, which are like the exchanges from which all the fibre feeds out, back to the 121 points of interconnect where we hand off traffic to our customers. So all of that infrastructure has to be put in place, and that will take about 3 years or a bit more to do all of that. Now, once you have that, you have all of that for the whole 10-year build, basically. So there is an upfront investment in the way in which we're approaching the rollout, and it's a very sensible way to approach it, both from a design and a construction perspective.
Right, and that's for the entire fully ubiquitous NBN as currently designed, right?
That's correct. That's trying to connect up all of the roughly 1,000 fibre aggregation nodes back to those 121 points of interconnect. You need lots of fibre to connect all of those nodes together, and that same transit network, as we call it, is also used for the satellite earth stations and also used for the fixed wireless network to serve the rural parts of Australia.
Just a ballpark, you're talking about 20% of the total project is in that upfront infrastructure. Is it 10? Just a rough estimate.
If you're looking at the transit part alone, yeah, I think it'd be more like in a rough ballpark in the 10%, 10 to 15%.
Mike, presumably, if the coalition were to win and to shift to a fibre to the node network, that transit network would still be invaluable.
You would still need a transit network, yes, to reach all of the outlying places. And with a fibre to the node network, you obviously need tens of thousands of active nodes all over the country. And depending on what sort of speeds and performance you want to get, you've got to push those nodes closer and closer to the end user, which is why you literally will have tens and tens of thousands of them.
Mike, the delay in getting the Telstra deal through the ACCC has cost you 8 or 9 months. How severe an impact has that been on the rollout? And can you make up any of that lost time now that Telstra's on board?
Well, obviously we're going to try and do the build as fast as we can. The Telstra, the finalisation of the Telstra deal was one of the issues, and a major one, that has had an impact on the dates that we put in our original December 2010 corporate plan. Obviously moving from 14 to 121 points of interconnect has had a difference. Executing on the government's greenfields policy has also had an impact on how fast we can go and what our priorities had to be. And as I've said before, we were determined to get good value for money in the construction tender process, and so we did change direction on that halfway through to make sure we got that value for money.
How did you get around the unions in that changing direction?
It's not our job to deal with the unions directly. That's the job of our construction contractors, and we leave that job to them. We deal with them. The industrial arrangements that they put in place is really their business, and we obviously have an interest in making sure that they are competitive, the contractors are competitive, and make sure we look after the taxpayers' interests. So that's why we have a competitive process, obviously, in the construction contracting.
Mike, what are you most worried about now? Is it take-up rates or technology, performance, or politics?
Well, there's a whole range of issues, obviously, in a huge undertaking such as this, a huge technical undertaking. I worry about a lot of things. I'm not frankly that worried about the technical performance of the equipment, because we're not using equipment that's really on the bleeding edge of things. This GPON equipment and technology has been around for a while. Probably the thing that's we're stretching to a sensible limit, I think, is the 2 large satellites we'll be putting up for rural Australia to give them a very good service. So the technical side of it's not such a big worry. The take-up rates, I think, with the retiring of the copper network, that's not going to be really a big issue for us. And why am I reasonably confident about that? I just look, for example, at the latest ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics data, which has just come out for the year ending up to December 2011. And what we've seen an 80% increase in traffic download on the fixed network per user. That's broadband traffic per user per month. It's jumped 80% in a year. In the mobile network, the average amount of data per user has gone up just under 6%. So that's 6% on the mobile network compared to 80% on the fixed line network. Wireless is absolutely, and mobile is going to be ubiquitous, needed. We will all be using it, but the heavy downloading of big files is going to continue to be done on the fixed line network.
But at what point, you talk about the take-up rate not being an issue because the copper network's being retired, but at what point do you start switching people off? Because what I mean by worrying about that is that it potentially at some point becomes a bit of a problem, doesn't it?
No, I don't think so. We have an agreement with Telstra, which is once we have one of what we call a fibre serving area module, which is about 2,500 to 3,000 premises done, we declare that area finished, completed, and then we start an 18-month process of retiring the copper in that area. And the senior management of Telstra have indicated they would like to even do that perhaps faster if that's possible to do, and we'll all be aiming to do that. So I don't see the take-up rate as being particularly an issue, and in fact, on just the trial sites we have, on 2 of them, we're now approaching 30% take-up after a relatively short time. This is a very high take-up rate for fibre to the premise on an international basis.
Could I put it a different way? There are a lot of local areas that are very upset they've missed out in this first phase because they can't be sure what will happen if the coalition wins the election. Is it possible that a council or a community could go to you and say, right, I will raise the money for you to put the NBN in before the election and you'll pay it back when over time?
No, we just couldn't do that. It simply wouldn't be possible for us to do that. We have as I said, this is a big, complex infrastructure project. We are getting a big machine, a big kind of almost distributed factory into gear to roll out right across the nation. We just can't cope with constant changes and responding to that type of request. We would love to be going to everywhere in the country in 3 years. It's just simply physically not possible. But I have to say also, it has been somewhat overwhelming to see how many people are unhappy about not getting the NBN in the first 3 years, even though there's a huge number of critics. Yes, huge number of critics saying, we don't need this, nobody wants it, and yet we've been overwhelmed with people who are disappointed that they're not getting it.
You referred earlier to the series of issues which have impacted the timing of the rollout and delayed it. I assume there are financial impacts from those, and can you make up some of the financial costs incurred?
Yes, I think we can, and I don't want to preempt the corporate plan that we have been preparing now for some time. We'll be submitting to the government at the end of May. But of course, we're always looking at how we can do things more cost effectively. And while a project such as this always has its challenges, we're still feeling reasonably comfortable that we can deliver in May a corporate plan that the government will find acceptable.
Have the trials reinforced the view that as you progress, as you learn more about rolling out these modules, that you will actually be able to lower the costs? I've been associated with, with construction, with running factories for many, many years, and there's no indication that this project is going to be any different. We will find ways to save costs as we keep rolling out. And remember, we're doing the same type of thing, not exactly the same, but very, very similar in each one of these fibre serving area modules. We also have a very enthusiastic and competent group of suppliers, both equipment suppliers, service suppliers and construction folks who spent a day with us last week, in fact, looking at how we can both do things better and more cheaply, more cost effectively. And we understand they need to make a dollar out of this. There's no point, we're not going to be driving them to not make profits. We want them to make a reasonable profit. And I think working together with our suppliers and construction partners, we can find ways to keep reducing costs as this rollout moves on. The reason for the lower than proportional allocations to Victoria, Mike, is that because you've had this emphasis on rural and regional Australia?
Yes, and what you'll find if you look at the numbers, and we obviously did that analysis between rural and metro and between states, you'll find that the bigger states have fallen a bit behind as a percentage of premises, if you look at that, whereas the smaller states, obviously we want to, once we get going in those, and if you take, for example, Northern Territory, very big state, but not a huge number of premises or population. So once we get started in the Northern Territory, we'd obviously like to finish it. It's economical and efficient to do so, which means the smaller states are kind of a higher proportion after the first 3 years, and states such as Victoria, New South Wales and particularly are behind in terms of the premises. Now, the other thing that factors into that is we've been given instructions by our shareholder to finish Tasmania within 5 years, by 2015. So that's the effect. We've tried to make sure we've reduced that effect in going from a 1-year plan to a 3-year plan, and each year, as we update that, those percentages should get closer and closer to being really proportional.
Mike, do you think this is going to be a major election issue? That this is the chance the Labor guys have got to regain some ground because of the demand for this service? About what Philip might do?
Yeah, I'd like to think it wouldn't be, but perhaps I'd be a bit naive if I was to assume so. I mean, we would just like to obviously get on with the job and build the network, because certainly all of us here in NBN Co believe this is a great national asset that we will have at the end of this build. So we'd like to get on and do it. But being realistic, I think it is likely to be an issue at the next election. We certainly haven't seen any decrease in the intensity of the political debate around the NBN, and while I would like to think that it would perhaps subside, I think I'd be a bit optimistic thinking that's the case.
Do you believe you'll be able to service the capital that you've raised in time?
Well, as you know, we had assumed in our last corporate plan that we would need $27 billion in equity from the government, in which we'd provide a return a few hundred basis points above the long-term bond rate, and then that we could go to the debt markets and raise debt. Now, we still believe once we had the Telstra deal done, once we've begun the rollout, once we've got a sufficient number of homes and businesses passed, and we have got a take-up rate and we're starting to retire the copper, I think we will find people who are interested in investing, in providing some funding for the company. Now, those things are always very difficult to predict, but the best advice we've got is that at some point in the future, once we've got those things under our belt, we will be able to raise debt.
Could that happen before the election?
Before the election, we wouldn't even attempt it before the election. We wouldn't be sufficiently far advanced, I think, to go to the debt markets at that time.
But you're still confident that the project will deliver something above its cost of capital, Mike?
Yes. Now, as we've said, if you're remembering, what we've talked about is a long-term IRR of a few hundred basis points above the long-term bond rate, which the government is perfectly happy with. And if I can also stress, we have tried to factor into our business case no externalities at all, no productivity improvements for businesses, no economic benefits or social benefits, what this may mean for public education or public health. We factored none of those things into the business case at all.
Can you tell us whether your view about how the NBN will be used has changed at all over the past 12 months or so, in particular as you roll that out a bit and you start to deal with potential customers?
Yeah, I think we're becoming more comfortable that the growth rates in downloads are in fact what we expected, if not a little bit higher. What we're seeing in technology trends around the world, when I speak to telcos in other places, I think there's a growing recognition, while we need wireless, it just isn't going to do the heavy lifting. And most big telcos around the world are building 3G and 4G networks as fast as they can, and then trying to get traffic off them as fast as they possibly can. So everybody I speak to who's in the industry recognises we need a good, solid, fixed line infrastructure. What I think is becoming more and more apparent as we try to solve the issues, the demographic changes that are taking place, especially in supplying social services, the value to a nation of a standardised, ubiquitous national network, I think, is now really starting to be seen. And I think it's something that's not talked about enough. We only just seem to talk about speeds, but a standardised, ubiquitous national network has an enormous amount of value.
On that subject, I understand that Hutchison Vodafone is testing a fixed line phone service on the NBN, and part of where it's rolled out. Do you think that a big company like that, or other big companies plural, will compete against Telstra in just straight old plain vanilla fixed line phone services using the NBN?
Yeah, I think that'll happen. I think we'll see more products coming into the marketplace, and I think we're going to see an increase of fixed mobile convergence. It's been talked about as long as I've been, well, not as long as I've been in the industry, but for many years now. I think there's an opportunity for that to happen. And what we're also seeing, of course, is the trend for people wanting to get at content and material on the devices that they want to use at the time they want to use it. And we're seeing, that's the other trend that's happening right across the world, is the number of devices, the number of connected devices is going up quite rapidly. And people are using devices simultaneously, concurrently. People looking, for example, at IPTV, and at the same time they're using their iPad.
There's been a lot of talk about IPTV over the NBN, Mike. Are we also likely to see the existing free-to-airs on the network?
You very well may see that. I think we can see, I think once the network really does roll out, I think it'll be a complementary medium to other channels. For example, if you're going to broadcast a very popular sporting program right across the nation, then clearly satellite has some real advantages in that. But I think we will see in the future a combination, and we will see material that perhaps comes to a smaller demographic, more specialised, and that's what is happening. It is, in fact, as we all know, it's fragmenting. A network such as the NBN will be used for delivering entertainment services and perhaps displace some of the existing channels and complement some others.
Thanks very much for being interviewed today.
It's a pleasure.